actually gotten down to verse 5 of Isaiah 3. This is in a section that begins in verse 1, goes through verse 15, on the vengeance on the wealthy. The way Paul looked, I think that might have been, he said it wasn't his, but the one next to him. We have to have one of those go off just about every service, and that reminds everybody else to turn theirs on vibrate. Let's read these verses together. And Jason, would you read these 15 verses, 1 through 15?
Okay, sure. For behold, the Lord of hosts, takes away from Jerusalem and from Judah the stock in the store, the whole supply of bread and the whole supply of water. The mighty man and the man of war, the judge and the prophet and the diviner and the elder, the captain of 50 and the honorable man, the counselor and the skillful artisan, and the expert enchanter. I will give children to be their princes, and babes shall rule over them. The people will be oppressed, every one by another, and every one by his neighbor. The child will be insolent toward the elder, and the babes toward the honorable. When a man takes hold of his brother in the house of his father, saying, You have clothing, you be our ruler, and let these ruins be under your power. In that day he will protest, saying, I cannot cure your ills, for in my house is neither food nor clothing. Do not make me a ruler of the people. For Jerusalem stumbled, and Judah is fallen, because their tongue and their doings are against the Lord, to provoke the eyes of his glory. The look on their countenance witnesses against them, and they declare their sin as Sodom. They do not hide it. Woe to their soul, for they have brought evil upon themselves. Say to the righteous that it shall be well with them, for they shall eat the fruit of their doings. Woe to the wicked, it shall be ill with him, for the reward of his hand shall be given him. As for my people, children are their oppressors, and women rule over them. O my people, those who lead you cause you to err and destroy the way of your paths. The Lord stands up to plead and stands to judge the people. The Lord will enter into judgment with the elders of his people and his princes. For you have eaten up the vineyard, the plunder of the poor is in your houses. What do you mean by crushing my people and grinding the faces of the poor, says the Lord God of hosts.
So, these verses, again, dealing with the vengeance that God is going to bring upon the rulers or the wealthy. As we come to verse 5, when he says, the people shall be oppressed, every one by another, and every one by his neighbor, the child shall behave himself proudly against the ancient, and the base against the honorable. He's dealing with the aspect of poor leadership is the result of rotten social conditions. The social conditions become worse and worse. It's a place where disrespect, oppression reigns, and as a result, they have poor leadership. Doesn't that sound familiar with our society? As our society has grown worse and worse over the years, the leadership has grown worse and worse. We've had horrible leaders and very few good ones, it seems like. getting more like verse 12. Well, we'll get to there. Maybe not this week. Maybe this week. I don't know. Yeah, we'll get to that. Maybe that's... No, I won't say that. Isaiah does have a lot to say about the women, though, in his book. But our nation is following the same path, isn't it? You go back that great generation of the 1940s during the war, World War II, all of those soldiers came back. And what was the kind of the mantra for those people as far as their families?
Women had begun to be workers and bring the bacon out. They had to because of the war.
Well, during the war, that's true, but that's really one what I was looking for. But that was a problem. Didn't every family they wanted their children not to have to go through those things and to give them everything, have more than what their parents did? That was kind of the mantra of that time frame. And yes, it ruined the kids growing up because they gave them everything.
That's a natural instinct of parents. I want to be faithful to God first. That's the first thing
that is a natural inclination that you want your kids to have it better than you do. But the result of that many times was to give them everything that they wanted with no discipline. And then you started getting these, like Dr. Spock, idiots that, don't spank a child. You might warp his personality. Well, I'm going through time a little bit. That's what I was getting to in reality, the 60s. During that time, you had the anti-establishment movement, which included anti-church, anti-God, anti-government, anti-home and our parents. And then along with that, the hippies and the yippies and all of those idiots. And the moral condition of that generation was destroyed. And they grew up, they had kids, started having kids, and because they had no moral moorings, they couldn't teach their kids any. And then you get into that area where we could talk about a lot more, but the social and the moral conditions continued to degrade within our nation. And that's that generation then grows up without any moral moorings, anything to hold on to morally, and they become our leaders. And they go to Washington and they pass laws and they start dealing with things that immorality in their own lives, but they can't even decide that that baby in the womb is a baby. And so in the 70s, wasn't it, they passed, well, not really passed, but the Supreme Court ruled that abortion was a right, and that brought on greater disrespect for human life. Well, social conditions, the rotten social conditions leading to poor leadership, and that's what you have now. Well, that's true.
They demonstrate that, well, we'll pass a law. Whatever that
Our government now is ruled by the loudest cries, where anything and everything is offensive to somebody. And you cannot offend anyone. That is, I guess that's about the greatest sin in our society, isn't it? To offend someone or some group. And except the Christians, that's probably true. You can offend them and it's all right.
That got into the church too. They didn't want to offend their kids. In one church, we better calm that down. And Brother Big that night had a whole series. He went around and tried to whitewash that over and stuff, saying there's only one church and it's the Church of Christ. And all that's wrong when they're going to hell if they're in that church. It was one of the ones that I know of that kind of whitewashed that.
There were quite a few of them, but Mid-McKnight was one of the more well-known ones that did such. And you're right, that same thinking made its way into the church, and thus the disrespect that we saw within society, you saw it within the church as well. And now then, you talk about poor leadership in the church. Well, I would hate to see the results of having to or forcing elders around the nation to take a Bible test. I would hate to see the results of such, because the leadership within the church is rotten. But that's not what Isaiah's talking about here. He's talking about from the government standpoint, leadership within the government. And it came as a result of the social conditions where oppression, disrespect was ruling. They began to work upon the principle, might makes right. Whoever's the strongest, that's what's right. That's one of those rules. We talk about the golden rule. This one's the iron rule. Might makes right. So if I can do it, and I have the power to do it, then I can do it. And it's all right. Under such circumstances, though, everything as far as life and property is constantly at risk. If I have the power to go and take Ray's house, then it's mine. Nothing he can do about it. Of course, if he gets more power, then he can come and take it back and take someone else's and whoever he wants to. That's the idea of it's never safe in that type of a situation. It's always at risk. And that's the type of situation that he's describing here in verse 5. The people are oppressed by each other, and everyone by his neighbor. The child shall behave himself proudly against the ancients, and the base against the honorable. So verse 6, when a man shall take hold of his brother and of the house of his father, saying, Thou hast clothing, be our ruler, and let this ruin be under thy hand. The conditions were so deplorable, so horrible, that if you owned a coat, then you were counted worthy of ruling. And people were going to force you into that leadership because you had a coat. Now that's the condition in which they find themselves in. That person who has the coat, of course, does not desire the leadership, didn't want it, but the people were going to force it upon him because he had some possessions.
James condemns that where he says, you fall all over the rich man when he comes in with his rings and gold and clothes, but the poor man put that on a footstool. He was condemning that very thing.
The same principle that James talks about there in James 2, verses 1 through, I think it's 13, of here's a rich man and you fall over yourself for him, as opposed to the poor man and you stick him off in the corner someplace because he's poor, and you fall all over the rich person because he's rich. Well, these were falling all over in reality they would be pretty poor, but even though they were poor, they were richer than the other people because they had a coat. Now, most of the men in here right now have on coats or have coats with them. So just think, if you had one of those back then, they were going to force you to be the leader. And notice he says, let this ruin be under thy hand. It's not rain, it's ruin. In other words, the nation is in such ruin, it's been devastated to such an extent that nobody wants to rule it. Nobody wants to take oversight of it. But because you have a coat, you have a little bit, in other words, they're going to force it upon you and for you to rule over that.
That's what you hire preachers for, to come in there and get the congregation growing to 400 or 500.
And when that doesn't happen, then you fire the preacher and hire someone else. That is what happens in the church today. We have placed church growth as the responsibility of the preacher. And when congregations started figuring out that, well, the preacher can't do it alone, then we just hire someone else and we'll make him our evangel or over our evangelism. He's supposed to then go out and convert everyone, and no one else has to do anything, of course. And that's supposed to grow the church. Well, of course. And all preachers are supposed to have at least 50 years of experience and be between the ages of 25 and 35. They're to drive the fanciest cars and be paid the lowest amount of money. Now, you may think that I'm exaggerating, but I'm not exaggerating very much.
People used to say that. He said he's always been accused of going around just begging for money. He said, they're right. Because preachers are usually the poorest ones, and the elders try to keep them down.
That's true. I'm trying to resist saying too much about that, but that in reality, that attitude was fostered upon the church early on in the American Restoration movement. Alexander Campbell. He opposed getting paid as a preacher and thought it was wrong to do so, basically. But what he didn't have to worry about was money, because he was independently wealthy. He was a very wealthy man. Didn't have to worry about it. So he didn't have to take any money from anyone, because he was already wealthy. But you're right, that it started back in that time frame, and the remnants of it are still around.
That's some knockdown, drag-outs all over here in business meetings years ago about over the preacher's salary. How much he's not supposed to get paid that much.
3 hours a week, obviously, yeah. There's a lot, I know this is a different subject, but there's a lot of things that has to be considered in relationship to paying a preacher. And I'm not going to try and go into all of those details. And by the way, that house that you live in, that the church is giving him, if he preaches there, let's say 30 years, and then he has to retire, that house belongs to him, doesn't it? Why are y'all laughing, doesn't it? If y'all paid on a house for 30 years, it would be yours, wouldn't it? Oh, well, I guess it wasn't his, was it? But that's part of his salary. I'll tell you this real story that along that line. There was a preacher that preached for a congregation. This is several years back, so they had a house, and they allowed him to live in it as part of his salary. He preached there, I think it was something like 15 years, and decided to retire. They gave him a retirement party and everything, and gave him $1,000. Quite a bit of money, right? 5 years earlier than that, they had hired a youth minister who they paid him to allow him to buy his own house. He decided to move around that same time, sold the house that he had been buying, and made a $15,000 profit. The preacher, now with his $1,000 gift, had to go and find a place to try and live, because they needed the house for the next preacher. That house was a real advantage for him, wasn't it? As I say, there's a lot of things to consider along those lines. Part of that deals with the money that the congregation makes, how much they can afford to pay him, the common salary of people that would be in, if he was in the business world, how much would he be making? There's other things that should go into it. For example, how many, I know of preachers whose lives are basically cut short because of the stress and the strain of preaching. Should that be considered in relationship to paying him a salary? So there's a lot of things. Yeah. That's what I mean. You go out into the business world, what's he going to make as opposed to what's he going to make preaching? The Bible teaches a workman is worthy of his hire, but there's a lot of things that go into that hiring process, and his being worthy of that hire that he is going to make.
You see what they're doing with that government too? They're going to fire him Friday because he can retire on pension Sunday.
I didn't see that one, so it's a new one. I'm going to fire him on Friday so that he can't get his pension if he worked till Sunday.
He's the acting attorney general of the United States.
Okay. The acting attorney general. Well. Now, how did we get off on that from... we can blame that one on Paul. And then he just forced me to say all these additional things. Verse 7 then. In that day shall he swear, saying, I will not be a healer, for in my house is neither bread nor clothing. Make me not a ruler of the people. So here's this one possessing the coat that they're going to come and take by force and make him to be a king or a ruler. And he's refusing to do so. He's got the coat, but he's saying, I don't have any food. I don't have any clothing in my house. So don't try and take me and make me a leader. The idea of healer there is someone who's going to heal the nation. Nation's in deplorable condition. And they are now, as a leader, expected to heal the nation. In other words, get them out of that deplorable condition that they're in.
I think that's when he responds, it seems to be real quick, too. They say that, whoa, don't.
Wait a minute, no way. I don't want this. I can't heal this. It does seem to be that way, that they're going to come and make him and all of it. I mean, just immediately. No, absolutely not. I'm not going to do this. So.
They would say that's why they lifted the hand up. Swearing, whoa, don't make me. I don't know if that's it.
It would certainly be with that idea. No. Kind of, someone throws their hands up and starts backtracking. That's basically what we're saying here. And the reason being that the spiritual cancers of Judah are beyond their ability to correct. Take our society. Please take our... No, How many of you think you could cure all of the moral and spiritual ailments of our society? Come on, surely all of you can, right? Are you all saying that it's beyond your ability to correct the moral and spiritual problems of our society? Well, go into the inner cities and the gangs and see if you can do that. Even get them to want it. They don't. That's the problem. And you're right, it would take their desire to get out of that condition. They don't have that desire. And yes, I'm being a little bit overly dramatic on all of that, but that's exactly the situation you have with Jerusalem and Judah here. Their condition is so bad that these individuals that they want to conscript into service as a leader are saying, I can't do anything about the situation. It's beyond help. How many think that as a nation, talking about it as a whole, is from a moral and spiritual standpoint beyond help?
That's what he said in the first chapter, he said from your head to your feet, full of wounds and busting sores.
Yeah. Spiritually speaking, that's what they were. They were so far gone that they were beyond help. But isn't that descriptive of our nation as a whole?
When they're running headlong the wrong way.
They are running headlong the wrong way. That's true. How can you help them? You can do all the talking to them that you want to do, and how much good does it do? Not much, does it?
You might have a chance at their own deathbed, as long as they don't get healed. If they get well and go on, well, then they'll get it.
Yeah. They're going to go back to where they were. We
Tell you what help they want.
Yeah, and so many times the help that they want is not the spiritual and moral help. Isn't that familiar from John the 6th chapter? And Jesus saying, you sought me not because you saw the miracles and believed, but why? Because you got the food. You got fed. And that's why you're seeking me. Yeah, pay the rent, put gas in my car, and I'll take care of it.
They have every Thursday or every Wednesday we give her food. That's all they come.
Yeah.
They get the food, they leave.
Get the food and leave. And these congregations can't figure out that that's why people are coming. They need to study John the 6th chapter a little bit. But verse 8 thus is a continuation, really. Make me not a ruler of the people, because I cannot heal the people. Verse 7, verse 8, for Jerusalem is ruined, and Judah is fallen, because their tongue and their doings are against the Lord. So here's the reason that these individuals are refusing to take this leadership role. They are beyond repair. Isaiah here uses a prophetic perfect. Now, anyone want to take a guess as to what a prophetic perfect is? No? It's whole big, nice jargon for saying that something is spoken of as already taken place, and thus past tense from our standpoint, even though it's yet in the future. So here's something that's in the future, but it's spoken of as already taking place. Now, why does he use that? Again, a prophetic perfect. It's because he wants to show the certainty of the event. Israel is ruined. Judah, and us, is fallen. Had they fallen when Isaiah wrote this? No. But he says it's already taken place. It is fallen. So, it is a prophecy, but it's spoken of, even though it's a prophecy, as already taken place. So it's spoken of as history. Something that has already happened. It's history, even though it's in the future. Why? Because of the certainty of that taking place. Thus, Israel or Judah is fallen, not is going to fall, but it already has happened. Why? It's still in the future, but the certainty is so certain it's spoken of as already happened. That's a prophetic perfect. Isaiah, and actually most of the prophets, use this quite often. They are showing the certainty of something that is going to take place in the future by using past tense. Carl?
Is that because of their knowledge of what God says? He says, if you do this, I will do that. And they knew God wasn't a liar, so as soon as the Israelites started doing that, he knew what the outcome was.
Well, not only the prophet, God said it, but and God was speaking through them. God knew what was going to take place. And so he can speak of it as having already happened, even though it's said in the future. It's pretty much what?
The state that we're in.
The state that we're in. You know, how many times can we see things that are going to take place, even though it's hadn't really happened yet? You know it's coming. Why? Because you can see the telltale signs, as we use the phrase. And because of those telltale signs, we know this is going to happen, and we speak of it almost as in past tense. We don't do it because we know that some things can always change, but God knew the situation, and thus he could speak of it as with a real and true certainty, this will take place.
It'd be like you trying to get to Montgomery or to get to Mile on half the gas. I know I would slow down I would stop somewhere between here and Alabama.
There in Alabama. When you said home, I was saying about, well, your car's doing awful bad miles per gallon if you can't get to your house from here. But if you're talking about Alabama, yeah, that would be, you know that you're going to have to get gas. You'll run out of gas. Yeah. So Israel, or not Judah, Jerusalem, is beyond repair. That's what they're saying. They have spoken and acted contrary to God's will, contrary to God, and thus provoked the eyes of his glory. In other words, the all-seeing eye of God, his eyes of glory. They've provoked him and his eyes, contrary to his will. Verse 9, the show of their countenance doth witness against them, and they declare their they declare their sin as Sodom, and hide it not. Woe unto their soul, for they have rewarded evil unto themselves. They have no shame. They don't even try and hide their sin. They actually flaunt it. They glory in their sin. Doesn't it sound like, take homosexuality. Please take it. Go back 1950s and even going into the... If someone was homosexual, he better not show himself and allow people to know it. Why? Because he's liable to be beaten a half an inch of his life, if not his life taken. could not be in the military. It was a shame. Now then, it is openly flaunted. They get out in their parades, and they chant about their wickedness and their sin. They flaunt their sin, just as Sodom did, the sin of Sodom. Well, thus they hide it not. That's then. We see it now in our society. And so, woe unto their soul. They have rewarded evil upon themselves. That phrase is pretty much saying the way in which we would say it, they brought it upon themselves. You're going to get what you deserve. You flaunted this wickedness and sin and evil. You've gloried in it. And now then you're going to get what you deserve. Well, I know Andrew's about to ring the second bell, so instead of going into verse 10, we'll stop with verse 9, and Lord willing, start with verse 10 next week.